What's up, Trunk Slayers? How you doing? Want to talk a little bit today about bad MSPs. I was reading a post on Reddit the other day. I feel like I start a lot of videos off like that. That was basically asking the question about how does a bad MSP stay in business? I've seen this post before. I'm sure many of you have heard this before on various platforms. This idea that I've come across a competitor or a client, they are doing something, that something is objectively terrible. How possibly do they still have clients? I don't understand this. And I gave some answers in that Reddit post about how I think it's possible that a bad MSP could still be in business. That's not really what I want to talk about today. I'll probably talk about that in the future. What I really want to talk about today is this idea of a bad MSP and if that's really a fair thing to just throw out these days. Recently was on a roundtable that MMN hosted that was basically talking about what are the bare standards that you would need to have in place to support a client. And what I thought was interesting, and the reason why I'm mentioning it now, is we had some really smart people on this roundtable and we couldn't really get into answering the question because of the fact that we couldn't get past identifying the target client, the ICP. And why that's amusing to me is because we had all kind of taken it as a given that at this day and age, any MSP is probably going to be executing on the bare minimum baseline standards. And that's kind of where I wanted to go with this. I've said in some previous posts, and I still stand by this, that we're a very young industry. We are a young industry. This industry hasn't been around for very long. We don't have independently regulated standards yet. We don't really have federal guidelines. We don't have an FDA that's telling us that we need to wash dishes at a certain temperature. None of that exists. However, we have been an industry long enough where if you participate in the industry and you don't live in a tiny little island where you've never talked to anyone else, I think it's very hard these days for any MSP to not execute on the basics. They might not execute on the basics the way you would execute on the basics, but I think we would all be hard pressed to actually find a serviceable MSP that isn't doing basic things that most of us take for granted. And the reason why I want to kind of highlight that point is I think this idea of assuming that you're the only MSP that's doing it well, or you're one of the only MSPs that's doing it well, or to flip that around, everyone around you is terrible, or all the MSPs in your market are terrible. I don't think that's an accurate statement anymore. And I don't think you should be resting your laurels on that and sort of settling on that pillar and acting like you're a little lonely up on your pedestal. I don't really know that there's much of a pedestal there anymore. How many of you use a tool like rapid fire tools to do a pre-assessment before you sign a client? I'm going to guess most of you do. If not rapid fire tools, you use something similar, and I'm fairly certain of that because this entire industry has been telling you you need to do that for the last 30 years. All of us do some form of that. How many of you know that your best client's network, the one that you've done the best job of, would stand up perfectly to that kind of assessment? No one should have their hands up because all of us know that's the meme, that's the joke, that those tools are BS because they always find mistakes even when they're not mistakes. I think that really sums up why you shouldn't be assuming that other MSPs around you suck or are bad or are terrible, and why that's a risky proposition to have for how you're positioning your own business. To be clear, I am not advocating that you don't celebrate that you're great. And in fact, if you feel that you're the best, absolutely lean into that. You may, in fact, be the best. Just don't assume that all of your competition in your market are terrible, because they're not. You might be saying, well, hey, Dean, I don't think about my competition, which is awesome. That's awesome. Um, but I don't care about any of this. Okay, but do you use it when you evaluate a client? How many of us have gone into a client where there are some small red flags that perhaps this client is not a good fit either for our maturity level or our ability to render service, and have looked past the fairly telling red flag that we're like their third or fourth MSP in the last 6 years to a decade? That's probably not because the last 3 or 4 MSPs sucked. That's probably the client. You're probably going to suck too. And that's kind of where I'm going with this. Don't use this whole like, oh wow, like I took over this client and most of the things of the client were fine, but boy, there was a lot of stale AD entries for old hosts, and what a terrible MSP. Why don't they care about that at my MSP? We have such and such a process where we make sure that doesn't happen. That's awesome. You have that process. That's a great process to have. Don't discount the other 99% of the environment that was probably managed really well, that the client also didn't acknowledge was managed really well. I was very fortunate over my time working through my MSPs to do a lot of onboardings. We just had a great system, and we were very lucky that we just had a good reputation, drove a lot of business. So I was very fortunate to be in an area where I got to take over a lot of clients from a lot of MSPs. And earlier on in our journey, I did used to look at it like that. Like, wow, this exiting MSP sucks. They're terrible. What they're doing is terrible. And at that time, ThinkTech's so much better. And what I started to learn as we move forward and we improved our standards and processes, so I'd take over clients, they'd be like, huh, this is actually really well managed. And I remember there was a particular client that we took over in southeastern Massachusetts that had a Unify system. And a Unify, for those that don't know, is kind of regarded as like prosumer level gear. I use it at home. A lot of us use it at home. It's pretty great networking stuff. It does not have a reputation like Cisco or Palo or Meraki. Not bad, but So we go into a client environment that had a bunch of Unify stuff, and my first reaction was to be like, look at these trunk slammers, slinging Unify gear here. What kind of trunk slammers are they? That's how people talk in southeastern Massachusetts. But as I went through, I was like, wow, what a really well set up network. Everything's labeled. There's segregated VLANs. Things are tagged. The Wi-Fi was actually like somebody clearly did a Wi-Fi site survey before they just put in access points. Every access point wasn't cranked up to 1,000. And it made me realize like what a competent job the last MSP did installing. This is a really good network. And what was funny was one of the main things that the actual client was blaming the last MSP for was a terrible network. And dramatic foreshadowing, it wasn't the network. That's kind of what I'm trying to point out here. As a quick aside, I had the great opportunity to meet the primary technician from the MSP I was just talking about a number of years later. And this technician's amazing. Like one of the best MSP technicians I ever met, super knowledgeable. And I would go as far as to say, having gotten to see more of this MSP's clients, this MSP is really well run. And so, not that we needed that extra bit of evidence, but like I found out afterwards, once I was kind of disconnected emotionally and financially from the situation, like, yeah, the MSP who took this client from is really good. They have great standards. They do an excellent job executing. They didn't suck. And we didn't suck either. In fact, I've met very few MSPs that are actually terrible, that really suck. I've met people that make mistakes, but I've never really met an MSP where just like wholeheartedly they're terrible. And I would argue that if somebody was that terrible, they probably wouldn't be in business. So that is something to think about. If you come up across another MSP that you fundamentally disagree with and think everything they do is terrible, but they've been in business for a while, they're not that terrible because people are willing to pay them. But TLDR here is just check that if you're an employee somewhere, and check that pride a little bit. I'm not telling you not to put yourself and your company up on a little bit of a pillar. Be proud of what you do, but don't people around you for a couple of reasons. It is a small industry. You never know who you'd be working for in the future. but also because you're probably not as good as you think you are, and they're probably not as bad as you think they are, and that's okay. And then if you're in that position, probably more at that sales level or executive level, keep that in the back of your head when you're prospecting your clients. How many MSPs have they had previously? And how many of them do they blame for all their problems? Because I can say with almost 100% certainty that if every MSP they've dated has been bad, it's probably not the MSPs that are a bad date. And you all know the human analog. Everyone who's listening to this knows a person or of a person who is the same way with dating, where they will say every individual I date is terrible or a jerk. Statistically, it's unlikely they are that good at only picking jerks. The common variable is the person saying that. So just keep that in mind. Most of this industry, not that terrible. Most of you are doing a baseline decent job. So good job, MSPs, and have a great rest of your day.